see all of you here tonight, and I'm so privileged to be in conversation with Lulu about this phenomenal limited series. So let's just dive right in. At Hello Sunshine, we spend a lot of time with books, and we're really fascinated by the process of adapting books for the screen. And obviously, this was really a big project for you from the very beginning. And so I'm very curious to know, can you tell us about how much of the book you were really faithful to, and how much of this was sort of your own life and your own experience that you infused into bringing this to life on screen?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here, first of all. I have to say, I love American Cinematheque. It was basically my film school, because I didn't go to film school, and I used to live down the street from here, and I used to come here all the time and watch Q&As just like this one, so this is really special for me, and thank you for coming. Yeah, so, I think that whether I'm adapting my own life or a book, I'm always looking for the overlap of like my personal life and what I really relate to, and whether I want to spend a lot of time in that world. And I just love this novel. It's called The Expatriates by Janice Y.K. Lee. If you haven't read it, you should. So I love the tone of it. I really love that it was a meditation on so many different types of people. And I'd always wanted to spend more time in Hong Kong. And so as we were adapting the novel, we were faithful, I think, to the tone and to the themes of, different types of people, victimhood, the perpetrator, people who are guilty of things, and to the themes around class and privilege, motherhood, grief, so many things. But I also wanted to, because it's a 6-part series, wanted to really expand. So there were certain characters, like this episode, for example, was not in the book at all. So Puri and Essie were characters that were in the book, but I said to Janice, who was in the writer's room, and I was like, well, if you could write a whole nother novel just about them, what would that be like? And so we just talked and expanded those characters and decided to flip the perspective.
I love that, and I love this episode so much. I just thought it was so brilliant that you shifted the story, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. But speaking about sort of shifting, let's talk about behind the scenes. I know that a lot of the crew was actually crew that you worked with on The Farewell, and I also know that representation and inclusion is an essential ingredient for you in everything that you do. So I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit about sort of how you assembled the crew, what the experience was like of making the show, and the things that are most important to you as a filmmaker.
Well, I think that for the crew, we were working in LA and Hong Kong, so a lot of the crew was out of Hong Kong. But it was really important to me to bring my crew from The Farewell onto this. I feel like so often when you are jumping, and you know this, when you are, a filmmaker jumps to a bigger level project, bigger budget, bigger scale, you're told you should surround yourself with people who have more experience and have done that, and I just felt like I wanted to grow with my team. It was really important to me that we made this transition together, because The Farewell wouldn't have been what it was without them. And so that was really important to me, and I do have a really diverse team. I have a lot of women on my team, and some people are like, that's so great and courageous and bold and, like, good for you. And I have to say, I don't think I set out to do it as some moral thing. I did it because they were just better. They were the filmmakers that I loved, whose work I loved. And I also find their perspectives to be more interesting. Like, I love having a crew that has different perspectives than I do, and also have known me long enough that they're not scared to tell me when I'm wrong. I think that's really important as you grow in the industry, because if you start working with people and you make more and more things, people might be scared of you. You don't even realize it. They might be nervous to tell you, actually, this is kind of a problematic take, or, this would be more authentic. And so for me, it's like, if I surround myself with people who can help me, tell a better story, then why wouldn't I do that?
I think it's so smart. I think it's also, I mean, you just hit upon so many things in one answer, but I think giving people opportunities to learn and grow and sort of prove what they're capable of is really an essential thing. I think it's something that female filmmakers do in a really extraordinary way. I just love that you're loyal. I think that that's great, and giving people opportunities, I think, is the name of the game for sure. Talking about incredible women. So you worked very closely with Nicole Kidman, who was a producer on this, and I know very, very, very involved from the very beginning, but curious to know what your collaboration was like from beginning to end, and just what the experience was of working with her. She was so magnificent in the series, and would love to know sort of the behind the scenes situation too.
Yeah, I mean, Nicole is an EP on this, as well as being performing in it, and so we had to really separate those two roles because as a producer, she has an overview of the whole project and is problem solving and making sure things are running smoothly. But as an actor, she has to show up on set and just really lose herself, forget about Nicole, and lose herself to Margaret. And so it was just clear from the beginning as we talked that she wanted to separate those two roles, and that when she was on set that she was not there as a producer. But as a producer and as a star, I guess at first I'll be honest, I was really intimidated, and I think that's one of the reasons I initially wasn't sure I wanted to take on this project. We're from such different backgrounds, and she's Nicole Kidman. I just made a movie about my grandma, like a very small movie. Why would I wasn't sure if we were going to see eye to eye on this project, and it helped in the beginning that I had that hesitancy because we had some difficult conversations early on, and drew boundaries around like what was important to me. And she was like, yeah, I support that, I want that, and so that really helped, because throughout the whole process, it helped me to, it helped our conversations, because very early on I was like, this is what I want to do. Like very early on, sometimes you sign onto a project and everyone's so excited, you get caught up in the excitement of it, and then you go down the road and you're like, oh, actually we're seeing it so differently. But she was so game to do this episode where I was like, you're not gonna be the star of it. You're not even gonna show up till later, and you're not gonna look very good through the eyes of these other characters. But that's important. And she was like, yeah, like it is important, let's do it.
Can you just, following up on that question, can you talk about some of the other things when you said you sat down with her and you said, this is what's important to me? I do think it's so essential at the beginning of a journey to talk about what's important to you, what's important to me. What were the things that were most important to you at the outset of this, and what were the things that you guys talked about?
It was what we talked about. I said I have to bring my team. I was like, I've heard about Hollywood and how you guys do this. Like, I'm not gonna do this if I can't take my entire team. And she was like, okay, done. And what else? I talked about this episode. I talked about tackling the politics and how that was really important to me. I talked about how a lot of the characters weren't going to be likable, and that was really important, that these women weren't just going to be portrayed. I mean, there are things you like about them, and maybe not, and then there's other things, but that I wanted it to just be, characters that were really complex. I'm trying to think what else. I basically talked about the structure. I wanted it to be 6 episodes, limited series, because Nicole and Amazon originally had this idea of doing it as an ongoing series, and for me, having read the novel, I just couldn't see it, and my brain doesn't work that way, at least not for this particular story. I really saw there being a beginning, middle, and end. So those were some of the things.
I think you did an unbelievable job of creating complex, dimensional characters across the board, and I can only imagine that the casting process must have been really daunting. So obviously you have Nicole as Margaret, you have Sara Yu as Hillary, and then you have Ji Young as Mercy, and they were amazing. But then you have this sprawling ensemble, which I'm assuming some of the casting was done here, some of the casting was done abroad. I would love to just know how you did it and what that process looked like.
Well, we worked with great casting directors, Julia Kim and David Rubin, and I think we were looking for very specific things for each character, but then also keeping in mind this ensemble and how these women were so different, but they needed to fit in a way, right? Like like they needed to have the screen presence of Nicole to match up. And I knew I wanted Hillary to be like funny, and just, when I saw Sorry You, I was like, she's perfect. She brings such range, she brings just a different tone. And I'm somebody who always tries to find the humor. And actually, Nicole said to me when she brought me the novel, she was like, okay, the book's really sad, but you can make it funny, right?
Sure.
Yeah, she's like, I know it deals with a missing kid and all these terrible, but you make cancer funny, so you can make this funny. Oh my God. I tried my best. But yeah, so I think having someone like Sorry, who her experience is in comedy, just brings a different tone. And then with Ji-young, we knew that we needed a discovery, probably somebody really new and just vulnerable. Like, what I love about this character is that she presents as being strong and like an adult, but which is so like young people these days, right? It's like they have to know so much about the world and present like they're so adult, but then you realize she's actually a kid. She's in her early 20s. And she's lost, and she's confused, and she's got this traumatic relationship with her family. And so then, we were also casting in Hong Kong, in Manila, which is where we found Ruby Ruiz. She's amazing, yes. I think she's like the beating heart of the whole show. And I just love that scene with her and Margaret, because they are just women from such different worlds. And they both hold their own in that scene. They're both really strong, but they're also just so different, And then Amelin Pardinia, who plays Puri, is actually a singer. She's not an actor. She's never acted a day in her life. And she was in Hong Kong. We were casting locally and just looking for singers. Because it was such a specific role, and I said, it doesn't matter, let's cast a really wide net. And so we looked at people who, we looked at singers, even if they didn't have acting experience, and she was really nervous to do this. She's like, I've never acted, but as soon as I heard her sing, I just knew that she could do it. And so I think it was challenging getting everybody from so many different backgrounds and experiences all into one world and feel like they're all believable in the same world.
I will also say I thought your direction was magnificent. I mean, they were incredible scene partners to each other, and I think they really draw you in and then break your heart. It's beautiful, and those performances don't come without a great director that you can really trust, that will guide you exactly where you need to go. So just kudos to you, that was amazing. And also, as you're talking about these extraordinary women, it makes me think about this theme of motherhood. And I will say, for me in my work and in life, I'm always so drawn to stories about motherhood. And what I loved is that you have these 3 different storylines, and each of them is about motherhood in a very distinct and different way. And I'd love to hear you talk about if that was something. I know that you were talking about the themes of motherhood among the important things to you, but was that something that you really wanted to carve out from the very beginning? And can you talk about sort of the 3 different storylines and the stories about motherhood that they're telling?
Yeah, so in the novel, it obviously also centers very much around motherhood, but Hillary's character also in the book wanted to be a mother and was looking into adoption, and she ultimately ends up adopting. And in the writer's room, because we had just this incredible group of women in the room, we all decided that it was really important to also represent a woman who didn't want kids and what that was like. And not that she was internally conflicted, but how people around her wanted to believe that she didn't actually know what she wanted, and the complexities of that decision. And so that was definitely something that, so we changed that from the book, and just keeping in mind that all of these women have such a different relationship to being a mother. Like Ruby's character Essie leaves her family to raise someone else's kids, and this is something that happens, that is really prevalent all over Asia, all over the world probably. Yeah, and so we just want to, and then the way that Mercy, I'm like hesitating because I don't want to give away spoilers.
I do want to say, if you guys have not seen episode 6,
Not yet.
after you watch this, go home, watch it on Prime Video. It's so amazing. I don't want to spoil anything, but understanding what goes into Hillary's choice to not want to be a mother, understanding the sacrifice that Essie is making, understanding the pain that Margaret is feeling, understanding the complexity of Mercy's situation and her relationship with her own mother. There's so much as you just saw in this episode, there's an equal amount to discover in the next one, and I do strongly recommend that you watch it. It's really extraordinary. But going to the first episode, I thought you made a really interesting choice to clearly center the story on Mercy, though in the first episode you don't really necessarily understand that that's what's happening, and you get more oriented in the second episode. But I'd love to talk about sort of the way that you chose to come into this limited series and the way that you decided to frame it around Mercy. I'd love to understand sort of what gave you that brilliant idea and what was behind it for you in the bigger picture.
Yeah, okay, wait, just a quick show of hands. How many people have not seen the rest of the series yet? It's all right if you, okay.
No, don't spoil,
No.
don't spoil.
Okay, so I'm not gonna spoil. But if you go back to episode 1, which is what I would recommend, it centers around Mercy, who, it's very cool actually. Like, I kind of created the series this way so that some people would watch episode 5 first. It works as a standalone, and then there's other people who watched it in order. But when you go back to 1, it's going to reveal a lot of things in here as well that you just saw. So, but yeah, it opens with Mercy because in the book, and I love this perspective in the book, that it's from the perspective of the perpetrator. It's from the perspective of somebody who is guilty and done something terrible or feels that they are responsible for this event, and they don't know how to live. Like, how do I deserve to be happy? How do I move on? And they can't forgive themselves. And so I found that to be a really interesting perspective, and also just centering this young Korean American woman in Hong Kong was interesting. She's somebody who is a fish out of water. She's not from there, but she's constantly mistaken for a local, and that's something that I really relate to. And so it's set up as a mystery, like of this tension between her and Margaret, and like what has happened between them.
I also love that there's something about the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. That Mercy, there was something that her mother said to her that she really carried throughout her life that has sort of been a part of her and been with her and perhaps haunted her throughout her life and has really defined her, and that so much of it is her emotional journey of coming into herself and into her adulthood, and I think it's really beautiful. There's so much that's so beautiful. There's a lot to talk about. So speaking of beautiful, episode 5, which you guys just saw, Lulu wrote it, she directed it. Obviously, this was something that was very important to you from the outset. I know you sort of talked about it loosely, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about what inspired the shift for this episode, what you imagined when you set out to sort of do an episode that departed, and went into different POV and told a bit of a different story inside of the same world, and then what you learned as you actually were making it and editing it and all of the things and how it evolved.
Yeah, it was just this crazy idea that I had of like, well, you know, if we're gonna break perspective from characters, like that's what's so exciting about television is you can jump, you know, you can be non-linear, you can jump time, you can jump into different points of views. There's really no rules of what you shift from episode to episode. And I thought it would also be exciting to just shift form. Like this is basically a feature-length film and that works as a standalone. And that was always the idea, that we would screen it at film festivals and other places, and people could watch this as a standalone even if they haven't seen the film, the rest of the series. I think what was challenging once we were actually in it was figuring out how much information to give, how much information to withhold, because there's people watching it from 1 to 6, right, in order, and you don't want it to feel like redundant, like we already know that information, why are we explaining all of that? But then people who haven't seen the series or jumping into this, you don't want them to be confused. And so that was a really tricky balance. But the way that I imagined it is kind of like an onion that you're peeling back, you know, and it's all of these layers, and it's not a linear story that's like A, B, C, this is what happens. It's about getting to know perspectives. It's getting to know all of these people, and it doesn't matter who you meet first. It's about, you know, once you meet them, once you know about them, you kind of see the situation, the tragedy through a different lens. And so that was the experiment. It's like, if you see this tragedy through this lens first, then how does that shift as you watch episodes, you know, 1 and 2, what information are you bringing to that, right? And then the other way around too, people who are watching it in order, they may not have ever thought about how Essie felt about this situation, and how, you know, how they see her because she's in the background as the help, and that's it. And so that's what was important, was for me to just really kind of create like a web that goes out.
I mean, I will say, as I was watching the season and I saw episode 2, the first thing that I thought was, what about Essie? And I loved that you answered it for me, because I was worried that I wasn't gonna get the answer, and I loved that in episode 5, I did. And I just love that, and I love her. So this was a really complex production, and I know, just as we were making Daisy Jones and the Six at the height of COVID, you were making this at the height of COVID, and there was a lot. And I think, you know, it's interesting because when you watch something like this and it's so elegant and so magnificent, you don't really think about how hard it was to make it. And I just think, particularly for people who are fans, it's an interesting bit of trivia just to know what were the really hard parts, and like, was there one scene in particular that you will always remember as being particularly challenging, and can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was a lot that was really hard about this series. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever done. I mean, first of all, psychologically, it was really challenging to, you know, we were all under lockdown, so to leave and travel just felt really crazy at the time. And there was also a lot of anger, rightfully so, but like there was a lot of anger about the show, you know, being a Western show, coming to Hong Kong during a pandemic, during a lockdown, and it being like a tone-deaf show about rich Americans, right? But in a way, we also, because we were dealing with politics, we also had to pretend that this was a tone-deaf show about rich Americans, so that no one would be watching us. And so, right, and like that's the Trojan horse, and so it was really challenging because part of me, you know, as somebody who's from Beijing, my family left in 1989 during Tiananmen Square. It's so personal to me, and it was really important for me to fight to make sure we were including the umbrella movement. But it's really dangerous and risky, and there was a lot of stuff that was happening in Hong Kong at the time that made it very scary to portray that. And so we had to just kind of go, yeah, we're just making a show about rich people, like, yes, criticize us, tell us how much, you know. But it was still hard, you know, and so in the midst of all of that pressure, we were also, you know, I didn't want to also lose the scale of Hong Kong. particularly this episode, right? Because we have the protests, because we have what's called the Maids Picnic, which is every Sunday, their day off. The scale of all of that is so tremendous, and then the storm and the number of extras that you need to create that. But you know, everybody was masked. Like, all the people on the street were masked, and we were limited to a certain number of extras that we could have. So I think, like, just trying to do something of scale. Like, a lot of shows, like, during the pandemic are like, oh, okay, let's do something that's really contained, and let's, like, you know, keep it interior or whatever, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to lose that. And so I would say this episode was probably the most challenging. You know, it's got so many different languages, working with consultants to make sure that, because I don't speak Cantonese, I don't speak Tagalog, and then also the rain continuity. You know, like, there's I never knew this, but it's like you can't actually shoot in a typhoon. You can't really even shoot in any kind of rain, right? So all of that was like rain machines, and then combined with visual effects, and then with a typhoon, it's about the level of rain and the level of wind. And because we were shooting all 6.5 hours of this series out of order, we might be shooting a scene, and then the next scene we didn't shoot for like 6 months, right? And so it was all like out of order, and so I had to go into the script and tell my rainmakers, like, I had to label the level. I was like, okay, this is a level 2 rain, this scene, and a level 2 wind, but in the next scene the wind goes up but not the rain, you know, to make it really feel authentic in the way that a typhoon builds. And so there was a lot of arguments about, like, this doesn't look like the last time we shot. They're like, it says level 2. We're like, well, what's a level 2 to you? Because that was a level 2. So there was a lot of that.
I heard that the night market scene was not the easiest, and I'm really curious to know, because it's obviously an essential scene in the series, but also a magnificent scene, and you know, you make it look easy, but I see that number of extras and I see kids, and I know how hard that's got to be. So would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, you know, we had to shoot it in, you know, a real night market, but that night market has changed so much since like 2014, which is what the series is set in 2014. So we redressed everything. We had to put a lot of stuff out. But then, you know, we were surrounded by locals, people who were trying to just like get on set, people who were trying to just touch Nicole. And she had to do this really emotional and traumatic scene, surrounded by, like, you know, paparazzi, people taking photographs, people screaming. So it was like really difficult trying to keep people away. And I mentioned, you know, there's also a lot of anger from, you know, with the pandemic and all of that, and her being there in the first place. And so, and then we're dealing with kids and kids' hours. And so it took several days of being there to get the entire sequence. And we, you know, at one point we were supposed to shoot, and we had set the whole thing up, and there was a typhoon. And so we were like, okay, well, we've set up, we have all of these extras booked, and we just had to scrap the whole thing, and ultimately ended up then having to bring the night market to LA, build it on a stage, on a sound stage with blue screen, and match it to stuff that we had already shot. Like, luckily we got all the live shots in Hong Kong, but then we had to recreate it and like make sure it still intercut perfectly. And so it was, yeah, definitely
Magic.
Yes.
And finally, I feel like this is such an important series for so many reasons, but I'm curious to know before we leave, what do you hope, if there was one thing that's really important to you that audiences take away, that they think about when they're done watching Expats, what is that?
Well, you know, I mentioned that this series was like sort of like peeling back an onion, right? Because this is really a series about empathy and, you know, empathy, grace for others, for yourself, right? Forgiveness of oneself, of others. And I think that what I hope people take away is just, so often we feel so certain in our point of view. Like we feel like we know everything there is to know, and we make these judgments. And the way that the show was made is in the writer's room, we were always like, oh, okay, like every time we feel like we might like a character, we're like, let's create a scene or situation that might shift that, and can you still, like, is that still okay, right? Because people are complicated and people have multiple sides and we don't know everything about them. And so I hoped that I could create a series in which you saw all of those different facets and people could feel complicated about all of these people and realize that they themselves are also complicated, that we're all really complicated and that we all deserve a bit of grace, and also that we're all really resilient, and that with grace and forgiveness for others, for ourselves, is how we can keep going no matter what you endure.
I love that. Okay, well, thank you to all of you.